Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. My name is Nirvan, and I have the privilege of being the managing director at ISMETA, the International Somatic Movement Education and Therapy Association. We are a nonprofit that's been around for over 35 years, and um, we work to grow the profession of somatic movement education and therapy, along with our individual members as well as our member organizations. We like to host events such as this to bring people together to further our knowledge and understanding of somatic movement and the ways that it impacts the earth and others that we're associated with. And we really like to present incredible speakers and leaders in our field, such as Jamie McHugh, who's going to lead our conversation today. So with that, I will turn it over to Jamie to continue and move into our podcast for today. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And for those of you who are watching the replay on YouTube and other channels, welcome to our conversation today. Just a little background about what we're doing here. This project started about a year and a half ago when I was approached by Elizabeth Osgood Campbell to create an ecosomatics forum for the membership. And so I created a whole series of resources and ways to help steer the conversation and awareness towards care of the body as well as care of the earth. And after that, Elizabeth said, "Oh, do you want to teach a class? You've got so much great material." And I said, "Nah, it's not really, the class isn't speaking to me. But what I'd like to do is actually be in conversation with people who are approaching this from different angles, primarily to create networks of belonging. We all have our own different bubbles that we're in. And so how can we cross-fertilize and begin to have larger conversations? And secondarily, to inspire people to take action. One of the things that I'm aware of is the disease of consumerism and passive compliance that we've all been raised, particularly in the United States, but in other Western cultures, and that the sense of personal power and agency, that's partly what we promote in ISMETA, is how can we have personal agency with our own bodies, self-regulating mechanisms and its expression. And at the same time, if we take that out into our lives, into the world, how can each of us be aware that we are co-creators with the earth body, that we are part and parcel of this planet, and so that individual actions are like many drops of water that of course create puddles, ponds, rivers. And so I like to think of it as many streams, one river. And what can each of us do basically to pay back the planet for its amazing abundance? And one of the things that happens very often with conversations about climate change is they can become very deflating, depressing, overwhelming. And my focus in the last couple of years has really been on focusing on the realm of biodiversity and how can we directly impact the land we live on. So today you might notice one of the links here is Global Rewilding Day. And so global rewilding is an effort that's happening across the planet to support nature in its workings, to really allow nature to teach us how to collaborate with the source of support. And of course, these days, with so much happening here in the US that is dispiriting, and so much of our attention is going to that, to remember the earth, to remember our place on the planet. And so I want to just start with this beautiful saying from Rebecca Solnit, who is a writer and activist in the Bay Area. Remember what you love. Remember what loves you. Remember in this tide of hate what love is. The pain you feel is because of what you love. And I think that's really important words to remember as we think about why we are feeling so deeply and with such pathos these days. There is so much at stake, and the pain that is stimulating just such anguish is because we love. We love this planet, the beings of this planet. And so, for me, this offering today in this conversation is really about a different angle on how we can protect that which we love. So I'm very happy to introduce Jason Davis, who I met last December at a talk here that he gave about his Climate Stories project. And for me, it really dialed me into this idea about how our stories about place and the impact on place personalizes and really brings home, oh, this is the land I stand on, this is the land that feeds me, this is what's at stake. And of course, we all have our own personal climate stories, and I kind of rattled through my brain thinking about them before we began this today. And because it's also International Glacier Preservation Day tomorrow, I'm really struck by, in 2018, I was an artist in residence at Glacier National Park for a month. And it was just an exquisite experience. I was there in October, so basically everybody was gone, and I would get on my bicycle each day because I really didn't want to drive, and I'd go different places and photograph, and yeah, I was just immersed in this environment. And it was in the last week that I was there, I thought, I haven't been to the east side of the park, and I want to see it, and I hadn't gone there because you have to drive a great ways around it. The middle road is closed in the park in October. So it was warm. I took my little tent. I went there, and it was actually very unseasonably warm. I mean, this is like towards the end of October in Glacier, and it was like a day of 70-degree weather. So already things just felt odd. I didn't really feel comfortable in my own skin in that heat because it hadn't been that warm. And so I'm hiking and hiking, and all of a sudden I come to this overview where there's two pictures of this glacier I'm looking at. And there was the glacier from the beginning of the 1900s, and then a picture from 2009. And there was something about being present. It's one thing to see a picture in a magazine, but to be present in that space and see the vastness and how much of the glacier had been lost. It was heartbreaking, and it just pushed me into I was furious. I went into a fury. I was furious at all the legislators who are ignoring doing anything. I thought, this is child endangerment. This is child abuse, because future generations are going to be impacted by how we've despoiled the planet in a grand way. And that day, it was just, here I thought I was so excited to go to the east side of the park and just bask in this, kind of a blissful day that just really turned the corner for me and realized it's like, okay, what am I committing to? What am I committing to? And so that was a pivotal moment for me. And this story I'm telling you is kind of my relationship to the project Jason's been doing. But of course, Jason, as you'll find out now, has been articulating and helping and guiding people with their stories. So we all have this possibility, sharing our truth, our story, and the impact of what's happening. Jason, welcome.
Thanks, Jamie. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation to be on the podcast, and thanks everyone so much for showing up today in your busy lives, I'm sure. And very powerful story, Jamie. I mean, it's it's hard to see the changes that are around us. And you mentioned anger. I think that's an emotion that can come up for a lot of us, certainly for me, but it's not an easy emotion to sit with. And sometimes I feel that it's not accepted in polite society, and just having a chance to sit with that and really tap into that is really powerful. Um, so I mean, I guess right off the bat, I would say one thing about climate storytelling is it is about emotions and not being afraid of emotions, or not trying to shut down emotions, or have your emotions conform to what you think people want to hear, or what's socially acceptable.
Mhm.
So I definitely appreciated that story that you told about seeing the changes in the glacier.
Yeah, thank you. So could you speak a little bit to just what motivated you to kind of begin this project in the first place? What was the kind of that spark that got you going?
So Climate Stories Project started around 2014. So it's been over 10 years, which is hard to believe at this point. It's been that long. That was not my intention from the beginning. I thought it was going to be maybe a year or something. So I have a bit of a strange background in music and environmental studies. I'm pathetically overeducated, so I have a whole host of graduate degrees, and some of those are in music, some of those are in ecology and conservation. So around that time when I started the project, I was just looking for a way to express climate change through music.
Mm,
And that was not a new idea. There has already been a lot of musicians and composers who use a technique called data sonification. Um, and what that is taking scientific data, for example, like temperature data from the global temperature increases, or it could be ice data from the Arctic, how much ice is how ice is changing every year, any data set related to climate change in this case, and turning the data points into sound.
mm,
So we're used to seeing graphs that show global temperature rise as turning data points into something, a visual representation of data, but you can also do the same thing with sound. And so composers have been taking climate data and turning it into pieces of music that have this data as part of the compositional material. And that's still something a lot of people are doing, and it is fascinating. I listened to a lot of these pieces, and I liked them, but I did feel like something was missing for me. And the thing that was missing was the relationship to us, to being a human being in this changing climate and what that means. Um, I had already worked on some environmental oral history work for a master's degree I did at the University of Florida, and I did a project in Costa Rica where I was interviewing residents about their relationship to a private protected area network in Monteverde, Costa Rica. I just got really into the process of interviewing and talking to people about their personal experience, and especially related to the environment.
mm, mhm.
So it's people's life story, oral history, but in relationship to ecology or to conservation or biodiversity. Yeah, I just found that really fascinating. So that was already in my brain, that approach to research and communication. Um, And then the third piece was listening to a composer, a classical composer named Steve Reich, who's best known as a minimalist composer. So taking like limited musical materials and making music out of those, like to really put it in a very small nutshell.
Hmm.
He's done a lot of pieces over the years that use voice samples. So that means taking recordings of people's voices and building music around the sound of the voice. And there's a technique called speech melody where you can actually transcribe people's voices and figure out the rhythms and pitches of their voice. So from that, you can use that as the basis of a melody or of a rhythm or a instrumental part. And one of the most famous pieces he did was called Different Trains. And that piece, it's a long story, but I'll try to summarize. He's Jewish and he was traveling as a child across the country, across the US in trains because his parents were separated, one in New York and one in Los Angeles. And he got to know the people that were working on the trains, like the porters, some of the other employees on the trains. He also had sort of a guardian who was going with him, I'm not sure, a family member or friend or something, but that was a big part of his childhood, was traveling on these trains. And he later reflected on that time, and it was during World War II. So he reflected on that time and thought if he was in Europe as a Jewish person, he would be traveling on very different trains. It's a powerful image of the Holocaust. So what he did was he went back to the people he knew as a child that worked on the trains, recorded interviews with them, and then also got archive recordings of Holocaust survivors and wrote a 3-movement piece that took elements of this voice samples and built the piece around that. So again, it's called Different Trains. It really just blew my mind as such a powerful piece that could express a very complex and difficult issue through music and the voice.
So the confluence of kind of music, text, or people's voices, and particularly focusing on a social political issue.
Exactly. Yeah. He's done other pieces too about different subjects, but for me, this was the piece that really hit me. So all those ideas came together around that, 10 years ago, and I just started working on some simple music pieces where I would interview people about climate change. I wasn't even thinking about climate storytelling at that point. It was just, I want to hear what people have to say about climate change from this personal perspective. And use those recordings, voice recordings, to make music. So that's how it started. As I mentioned, I thought it was going to be like a one year little thing, and that was it. But life's unpredictable. And I just started getting more interested in storytelling and oral history as a practice, and specifically with climate change. And what I more and more thought was missing in our discourse was the relationship we have as individuals or as community members to the changing climate. And when I was growing up, all the conversation in the media was about, well, in 2050 this is going to happen, in 2060 this is going to happen, and it just occurred to me that all this stuff's happening now. It's not just a future projection. So because of that, unfortunately, we all have something to say about the climate. And I'm certainly very aware of the difficult and unfortunate political issues that have cropped up around climate change and issues of corporate power and money and misinformation, which complicates this whole thing. But on a very simple level, everyone, if you dig deep enough, has something to say about their life and climate change. So that's really the basic definition of a climate story. So once things kind of got underway, and I decided to create this website, climatestoriesproject.org, which you're welcome to visit. And I started doing workshops with schools, mostly some libraries, some museums, environmental organizations to teach climate storytelling. So it's one thing to ask people to tell their climate story, but I realize people need some tools. People need some structure to do that. So we run workshops that give a prompt structure and give a container for people to start crafting their climate stories and sharing it with others. So that's grown up. That's been a big part of the growth of the Climate Stories project, is this climate storytelling workshops. And then, but the music part of it's still going on. I mean, I ended up doing my doctorate in Montreal at McGill University, focusing mostly on the music side of things. So I was working on how do I elaborate on some of the techniques I've developed for integrating voice samples about climate change and climate oral history into a presentation that I can bring to schools or to organizations to talk about climate storytelling, but also play some music pieces that illustrate the kind of work that I've been doing.
So one
There's
of
a
the
lot
things
going
I
on.
want to highlight is, in your story so far, is how you started off with something that was speaking to you and that you wanted to work with artistically, and then little by little, like how it grew, like it started in 2014 and one step leads to the next, and reminds me of one of my ISMETA colleagues, Martha Eddy, who in conversation with a few peers at Schumacher College one night decided that they wanted to do something around water. And since they were all trained in Laban movement analysis and Rudolf Laban's sense of movement choirs, they decided, let's do something about water. And little by little, that piece that kind of started with that inspiration has built to global water dances, which they do around the world for World Water Day. And so in a similar way, it was like that little spark. You had no idea what you were getting yourself into, but you were just kind of following the breadcrumbs, so to speak. And here you are now. And so what would you say is the what is the impact? What is happening with this movement you've started?
Well, I guess I wouldn't claim to have started it, but certainly it has.
I just meant particularly this project. Yes, of
Sure,
course.
sure. Um, I felt, I mean, on a personal level, I felt really, really gratified and good about the work that I'm doing. I also work with a colleague named Kelly Heydrich, who's in Massachusetts. I'm actually in Oregon now. I'm teaching at a university, Oregon State University, environmental studies here. I was in Massachusetts for a long time, and that's where Kelly is still. So we work remotely at this point. And we have a volunteer in Washington, D.C. named Grace Brock as well. So it's a small group. But amongst us, I feel really good about pushing this movement forward through storytelling and through narrative and education and workshops. I feel like everyone has to find their part with climate change, and those of us who care, and most people do care on some level, even though it's not always evident in what people are saying or what's in the public discourse. But often people are very unsure about what to do. It's such a big issue. And it seems like what do we have to do? We've been told about recycling for decades now, and a little bit more recently switched to electric cars, which is definitely not available to everyone. It's an expensive purchase. So a lot of people, I think, are left with this sense of I'm really concerned or scared, but I just don't know what to do. And what I've determined is that climate storytelling, is a really accessible way to enter this movement that doesn't ask too much of people. It just asks you to learn some skills to tap into your own life and your own thoughts and feelings about climate change, put that together into a story. It could be a recording, it could be written. We work mostly with audio and video stories that we share on the website. But it doesn't have to be anything elaborate. It's not like a produced Hollywood feature. It's just it can be a very simple audio recording you do on your phone about your experience and your response and your motivation for getting involved with the climate movement. So for me, that's the thing that keeps me going. You know, I fully 100% support people who are out in the front lines protesting or doing direct action to move the movement forward. It's just not something that I feel is my place. So for me, this storytelling project really feels like something I can make a difference with. And certainly I've gotten a lot of good feedback from teachers and from students and from other participants in the workshops about how it's helped them engage with climate change in a way that's more direct. And right now, we are working more on school curriculum. It's a fairly new part of the project. And that's just another piece of the puzzle of taking this format, climate storytelling format, into climate education. Typically, that's for years, it's been taught in a science format, which is necessary. Like everyone has to know the science, and that's very important. But giving students this platform of storytelling can really help them feel part of what's going on and part of making a more positive future. So for me, that feels like a positive step forward. Mm-hmm. And as long as I can, I'll keep doing it.
Yeah. So I think that's a great moment for us all, because we've been kind of talking in a way abstractly about this, to actually hear one of the stories. So right now, wherever you are, you can just maybe lie down on the ground if you like, or just sit back in your chair and close your eyes. And so we're going to listen to like about a 5-minute story, one of the stories. And so just to relax into your own body and breath and just receive this very sweet story.
So I'm going to introduce it, Jamie, or just want to play and get people to...
Let's just play it. Let's just let her, yeah.
Sure.
And then maybe say an afterword, you know. Mm-hmm.
My name is Jessica Lind Peterson, and I currently live in northeastern Minnesota in a small township called Canyon on the shores of a beautiful little lake. I live with my family in a single wide trailer on 6 acres of forest, wetland, and swamp. I spent my childhood summers in this area and recently relocated here from the Twin Cities at the start of the pandemic. The forests are filled with black spruce, soaring red pine, balsam fir, clusters of birch, and velvety swaths of tamarack. It is truly an embarrassment of riches. The air here even smells green. I grew up not far from here in Duluth on the shores of Lake Superior, and so I am conditioned for extreme weather, extreme cold, extreme amounts of snow. And while things up north here are still extreme, it feels different now. There's a weird edge to each season that feels unfamiliar. Lakes freeze later and thaw earlier. Birds fly back sooner. Instead of steady rainfall in the spring and summer, we are seeing fewer, more devastating storms with intense rainfall. 2 weeks ago, I sent my small son outside to shut the chicken coop as a storm rolled in. Just as he closed the door to the coop, hail the size of tangerines pelted down. The wind was like a god blowing everything sideways. Giant red pines bowed down and snapped in the middle like matchsticks. It only took a few minutes. The aftermath was chaos. As my husband and I wandered around the lake surveying the damage, the consensus from our neighbors was the same. They'd never seen anything like this. A familiar sentiment these days. Northern Minnesota has warmed more than twice as much as southern Minnesota. The fishing here has changed. Warming water is killing walleye and trout. Some lakes have resorted to banning walleye fishing for a season here and there, which has had a devastating effect on local businesses. Many lakes are full of algae blooms, which is ugly and suffocates the fish by sucking up oxygen in the water. I often see dead fish floating along my shoreline. Yesterday, a baby duck. I don't know if they're dead because of the warming water due to climate change, but I do know that normally when animals die around here, it's because another animal was hungry. As majestic as the forests here still are, I've noticed that they've changed. Up north, acres upon acres of birch and balsam fir are dying rapidly. Invasive beetles are getting too cozy. The winter's no longer cold enough to kill them off. Some landowners are cutting down their healthy balsams in preparation for what's coming. After all the harm we have done, I have a hard time being optimistic. I feel responsible and sad and anxious for the future. It doesn't seem our leaders care that we are killing the very planet that sustains us. I don't know what could be more important than saving it. Here, up in northern Minnesota, there are things we can do. As the climate becomes less suitable for black spruce, birch, and tamarack, local forestry experts are urging private landowners to plant eastern white pine, bur oak, and maple, trees better suited for warmer weather. I don't like the idea of changing the forests, of disrupting what is natural, but deep down, I know it must be done. Recently, my father-in-law, who lives in suburban Twin Cities, stopped putting fertilizer on his lawn. It didn't take long for the clover to sprout. Within weeks, he had a perfectly green carpet of tiny good luck charms. "Pretty, isn't it?" I said. "I guess," he replied, skeptical. Change is happening slowly, but we need to speed it up. The luxury of time is no longer a thing. And so, that is what we will do. We will roll up our sleeves and clean up our own mess. We will suck up the algae blooms with machines, stop our cars from idling, let the clover creep in, try to do better. We will take our chainsaw back into the woods and cut up the dead, split it, turn what was once a towering giant into small bundles of firewood, and use it to warm our cabin this winter.
A very strong story and just beautifully recounted. Anything you'd like to add to her story or the process?
Sure, I can give some background. So the story is from a playwright and an author named Jessica Lynn Peterson, who I first learned about through an article in Orion magazine. This goes back 5 years or so, at the beginning of the pandemic. And she just wrote a beautiful piece about climate change. I guess you could call it a climate change story, but in a very artistic way. You can tell from her voice that she has a background in theater and being a speaker. She's not just recounting facts about the climate, or it's very artistically done. And I just love the way she made this piece in the article, and then I thought it would be perfect to adapt that into a climate story. And so she sent this. I actually turned it into a music piece called The Council of Trees, which if you're interested, you can find on the Climate Stories Project website on the Climate Music tab. It just really moved me, and her use of imagery really stood out. And this is what makes good stories work, is it's not just telling people that, in this case, climate change is a bad thing and what can we do? It's really like saying, or it's showing what climate change feels like. She said, well, when she began talking about her connection to the land, she said, even the air smells green. And that's just this beautiful, it's not really an image, it's a sense of the environment. but that brings you somewhere. It's not just saying the land I live on is beautiful, it's the air smells green.
It's the poetic and the aesthetic, I would say, and of course, like with your music, is really connects us to spirit. That there's, the metaphorical mind and the way that we approach the planets, like you said before, a lot of climate change has been taught through numbers and facts and kind of what I'd call the technology or technological thinking. And what I hear in terms of your project and your music is injecting spirit into the conversation because it speaks much more directly to our subjective experience, to our soul experience. And that transcends politics, and that transcends, is this happening? It's what touches us internally that makes a difference. And then, of course, how we express that is how the art process can be very important.
Sure, and when we teach climate storytelling, the first prompt category we teach people is about connection to their place, their environment, their home place, their community, as a basis for building a climate story. And there's been research done by various folks out there, scholars, who have shown that what we care about, or the reason we care about climate change, is not because it's some abstract thing or that it's something far off in the distance or in the future, but it's really about, we care about people or environments or features of the ecosystem that are changing. And like Jessica talks about in this story, the forest she grew up with and she loves are changing, or we have to change them so they can adapt, or the lakes are changing, and you can hear it in her voice. She cares about those things, and that's what motivates her. And I think that's what motivates all of us to get involved and to make some kind of a difference in the fight against climate change, because we're not just fighting against some abstract idea or statistic. We're fighting for things we love and we care about, and that's the starting point that we teach for creating a climate story. And I think in all cases it works. You mentioned the politics, and it's a tricky issue. There are some places and some communities where just using the term climate change can trigger a negative response, sure, unfortunately. Yeah. But what we found, and other people have found, is that everyone cares about where they live, or cares about where they came from, or cares about their family. That's universal. So there are people I've worked with who say are located in communities where if you approach someone and ask them, hey, I'd like to hear your climate story, they wouldn't respond well to that. Right. Bring up sort of the defense mechanism and some of the challenging of core values, which often doesn't get us very far. So in that case, the conversation might just be about, hey, let's talk about what you care about in your home place and what's changing. Very simply like that. So you might not even use the word climate, and it might not even be about climate per se. It could be about development or about water pollution, and this touches on just the fact that we're connected to the environment, whether we see that in our daily lives, or our modern culture is set up to be disconnected in a lot of ways. So we don't have to think about, or we shouldn't think about, where our trash goes or where our water comes from, or what's being affected in the environment based on this system we have, economic system. So underneath that, I think everyone knows something is missing in the day-to-day experience of life. So starting the climate story with that connection to place, and with the encouragement to really tap into what it feels like to live in that place, and get into why you care about it, that can open a lot of doors. And certainly Jessica's story is a great example of setting that up in just such a poetic way.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I'm really aware that we are at time for our conversation then to kind of open up into conversation with people who graciously showed up today. Before we shift into that, do you want to say a little something about the training you have coming up that's starting soon, just to let people know what that
Sure.
program is?
Absolutely. So, in addition to running climate storytelling workshops for specific schools or organizations, we also have what's called the Climate Stories Ambassadors Initiative. And I think I see Carmine there in the audience who's done one of them. um, so the way that this works, the Climate Stories Ambassadors works, is it's a three-part training series for climate storytelling, but also climate story interviewing. So during the first session, these are all online, completely free. It's open to anyone in the world. So the audience we get is typically fairly international. So we have people from the US or Canada, but also from Europe, Latin America, West Africa, India, Pakistan. So what happens is you're on a training session with people from all over the world, learning about climate storytelling, telling and sharing their climate stories. So that's the first session. The second session, we teach about interviewing skills. So how to be a good interviewer, how to ask questions, how to listen well, how to do recording. And then the third session, we talk about using climate storytelling for positive change. And so if anyone's interested, I encourage you to visit the Climate Stories Project website, which I believe I posted in the chat.
It is in there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's there. Great. Just climatestoriesproject.org. It's coming up soon. The first session is, I don't want to give you the wrong date, so I'm just going to double check. April 3rd. Yeah, April 3rd, which is Thursday. So that's noon Eastern time. It's 90 minutes. So it'll go until about 1:30. The second session is April 17th at the same time, and the third session is May 1st at the same time. So they're conducted live over Zoom. If you can't attend all of them, that's fine. You can still apply to take part, and then say just go to two of them or one of them, and we record the sessions and we share them afterwards. We just ask that if you do sign up, that you commit to recording and sharing your own story and at least one interview with someone in your community about their climate story. So it's not a huge commitment. It's a great community. We've done, I think this is probably our 8th or something iteration of this. So it's been going on for a few years now. And it's been a really wonderful way for people to connect with climate storytelling for free. And it's totally accessible and really welcoming. So if that's something that speaks to you, I encourage you to go to the website and you can apply. And we don't turn people away. So it's just a form you fill out to give some information about who you are and why you're taking part.
You know, I love that it's international and that there's that commingling. It's like, how often do we have an opportunity to connect with an international cohort of folks? And I remember in the early days of the pandemic, COVID, there was something on TV at one point showing people all around the world dealing with COVID. So there was from Tokyo, and it really struck me at that moment. It's like, wow, this is a global phenomenon. And if we can kind of get through this and understand that we do share the planet, maybe we can mobilize the will to take on climate degradation, planetary dysregulation. So yeah, but yeah, let's open it up now to folks. I'm going to take us off spotlight so we can join everybody. So I'm going to remove my spotlight and remove your spotlight. And if I can figure out how to do that here.
I don't want to stare at myself for the rest of
Yeah, I'm sure you don't.
the
Let's
Please
see how
remove me.
oh, I see. It's over here.
There you go.
Okay. Okay, great. So I invite anybody who has, a response to anything we've been talking about or a question you might have for Jason, just to go ahead and unmute yourself and speak up. Looks like William Jacobson has unmuted himself. Nope.
Can you hear me?
Now I can. Yes. Welcome.
Okay, it's sort of a strange question. My focus is on deniers of climate change. Do you have any stories that you've had any success with, specifically with deniers?
Hmm.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good one. I guess a few ways to respond to that. One is that people who, for example, take part in our Climate Stories Ambassadors Initiative are typically a kind of self-selecting bunch. So we don't get a lot of people who say climate change is a hoax in those cohorts for, I guess, obvious reasons. I've had some interesting experiences with school groups over the years that are in more, say, politically conservative communities. And some of the students, when I asked them to tell their climate stories or record their climate stories, they didn't say outright that they don't believe in climate change, but we're certainly, I guess the word is skeptical. And one thing I don't do is teach people to their thinking is wrong. I think that technique has been tried for decades with pretty limited success, and all the research has shown that people's views about climate change have very little to do with how much they know about the science or about the environment, and much more to do with like their social circle or their peer groups or their political backgrounds. So certainly, as a workshop facilitator or a community outsider, it's not my job, or I think realistic, that I can quote unquote change people's minds that yes, climate change is real, it's a big problem. But the one thing that I do think is helpful and is a good technique for anyone who's encountering this, say you have the relative, who watches certain news outlets or social media and is convinced that climate change is created by the government and is a hoax or whatever stuff's out there. One strategy you can use is just to talk about your own story, your own motivation, without challenging that person to change their viewpoint. Because your story is your story, your motivation is your motivation, and that by itself is powerful. No one can tell you that you shouldn't feel that way about climate change, And maybe I certainly couldn't prove this scientifically, but maybe by demonstrating your motivation, someone might be willing just to open their mind a little bit to the possibility that if they're listening to you, that you have something important to say and your perspective is valid. So I guess what I would discourage people from doing is the tried and true "no, you're wrong" technique, which has been a dismal failure. I mean, I think I can say that pretty confidently. So there's been a lot of work on how do we communicate climate change with different audiences. My technique is this motivation piece and keeping it focused on why I care and why other people care. You can also talk about how many people care about climate change, and if you follow the Yale Center for Climate Communications, they've been working on this question for years now. What they found is that in the US, most people who respond to their surveys anyway are in either what they call the alarmed or the concerned category about climate change. We hear so much about deniers, but in their research, that's about like 9 or 10% of the American population. It's not very big, but they have a kind of an outsized influence because of all kinds of political factors and and social media outreach and so forth. But we have a lot of allies. You know, we have a lot of people that are really concerned or alarmed and are on the same side of us wanting to do something and just not being sure how to do that. So that's another factor is like maybe getting all wrapped up about the fact that there's people denying climate change and we have to change their minds or we're not going to get anywhere is perhaps a little bit misguided. Maybe those people are just going to be where they are and that's where they are. But there's millions of people that care about climate change and want to do something about it, but just don't know what to do, or it's just low down on their list of priorities, which is totally understandable. By giving them this chance to tell their climate story and speak with, say, a colleague or a neighbor about what their climate story is a pretty low bar of entry into getting into this movement. So that's a very roundabout answer, but hopefully that addressed at least the general idea of climate deniers and climate storytelling.
Okay, thank you. By the way, just a correction, Yale, I just looked at the latest Yale University numbers, and they lumped the bottom two categories together. The second bottom category is the ones who believe it's just natural, and the total is 22%.
Okay. Yeah, I think they've shifted a bit of their how they divide up these categories over the years.
Right.
So
But I think you're highlighting, which I think is really important, is this notion that there's kind of more of us who are concerned, and that it can be easy to get wrapped up in the opposition, so to speak, as opposed to how do we start where we are with our story, with our truth, and connect with people who are concerned, and eventually begin to find community-based strategies for how we move forward with this. It's like, dropping a stone in a pool of water and letting that ripple out. It's like, yeah, or as the Buddha would say, keep the company of the wise. So find others who can support a vision, a positive vision, because of course there's always going to be naysayers with any issue, not just climate change.
absolutely.
Jason, Jamie, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Carmine from Kansas, and I was so delighted to meet Jason about 4 or 5 years ago, and I was able to complete all the training. And I think I used my bicycle as my escape. My bicycle provided me all kinds of entertainment indoors and a journey throughout my entire life. And I'm a climate story ambassador because I wish to contribute to the positive journey forward. And our oral histories and our music can be powerful tools communicating how we experience, interpret, and respond to protection and preservation. And the neat thing is the kudos. Jason and one of his colleagues, Kelly, and were very supportive when I said, hey, I have this Kansas Library Association conference, and Kelly Zoomed with us, and we engaged librarians across the state. And we just introduced them to Climate Stories Ambassadors because librarians are very much concerned about facts over fallacy. And of course, anything set to poetry or music is an additional, wonderful accent. So thank you for being here tonight. I appreciate your expertise.
Thanks, Carmine. Yeah, it's great to see you here.
Speaking of the pandemic again, I've got to say, the silver lining from the pandemic is that Zoom became normalized, and that events like this can happen, or connecting with the librarians. I mean, it is a powerful way that we can share not only information but spirit. Spirit can be transmitted through this electronic medium. So thank you for sharing that story about the librarians and being able to coalesce that group with the Climate Stories Project. It's great.
Yeah, it's technology has its good sides and its not so good sides. But certainly, like, we couldn't have done this project before this technology came around. To have a collective meeting with people in Zimbabwe and California, and France, like that's 15 years ago or so. That would have been much more difficult. So like to have that opportunity is pretty cool. Uh, One of the first ones we did, this was back in the Skype era, pre-Zoom. I was working in a community, an Inuit community in Shishmaref, Alaska, which is a frontline climate community that has been on the verge of relocating from a barrier island where they're located onto mainland Alaska because of erosion from the sea encroaching on their land. Once they've lost a lot of sea ice, which used to protect the beaches, and now that's largely gone. So probably this village is going to have to relocate in the next few years. The same situation is true of a lot of Inuit settlements on the west coast of Alaska. So I was about to go up there, but before I went up there to spend some time, I did a workshop at a charter school in Connecticut called Common Ground, and mostly like inner city minority low-income students who probably for the most part I've never heard of Inuit anything, and it was amazing. Like we were in the classroom and I got a feed from a classroom of high school students in Shishmaref, these Inuit kids, along with an Inuit elder, talking face to face with these middle and high school students in Connecticut. It was crazy, this was like 2015, and that was like, wow, like you can actually do this. And the connection was spotty, it's rural Alaska, but it worked.
Mhm.
It was really cool to see that these kids were like blown away that they could talk to someone thousands of miles away from a very different culture, who's really the Shishmaref is such on the front lines of climate change. For the students in Connecticut to really see that, that's much more powerful than anything they could read in a book or see in a documentary. This is real. So the technology can be a bit abstract, but it also brings us together in really cool ways.
It's interesting as you're recounting that story, the image that came to me is kind of an aspect of the work you're doing is this sense of building bridges, just even that bridge between those two communities. And in the ambassador training, like you say, have people from all around the world are connecting around the shared purpose. And how beautiful that is. The more bridges that we can build and that greater connectivity can really inspire way beyond what we might imagine is possible. And I think for me, ultimately, that's really important with the work that we do, to dream beyond, envision beyond what we know we can do in the here and now, but that then leads us into greater capacities that we really couldn't envision ahead of time. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Paul,
Questions?
I'm just seeing. So Paul Leech put it in the link for an eco village in.
Oh, Paul Leech. I think Paul, if the same Paul Leech, I think he's contributed his story a few years ago. Is that right, Paul? In
Yes, I
Ireland?
did. Yes, I did.
What's
Um,
that?
I'm a little surprised we are so few here. It's not necessarily a numbers game, but I'm a little puzzled that we are so few. Do you want to comment on that?
There's 42 people that had registered for this event, and it's just kind of the way of it. And it seems like a lot of people register and then watch the playback, the YouTube or on the ISMETA site. So, and this is the first time we've done it later in the day because I got a request from people in Australia, who, by the way, I don't see here, saying, you do it. So I thought, we're probably gonna lose the folks in Europe because we get a lot of people from Europe who show up for these calls. But by doing it later in the day like this, I think we've missed the kind of the European folks. Except you seem to be here, so right on.
Yes, it's 11 o'clock at night here.
Right.
I heard something encouraging the other day, which is there's, this kind of work is about being ready when the superstructure that surrounds us, that is so absurd, collapses. We're looking at late stage metastasized capitalism with a democracy that has been completely subverted, with outcomes that are profoundly undemocratic to do with use of media and so on. And all you have to do is look at what's actually happening. You don't have to extrapolate anymore. It's actually happening. And there's some fatalistic tendency in the human psyche that seems determined on its own extinction. Even corvids seem smarter than so-called sapient. So there's some kind of pathology there that must run its course. And being ready is part of the agenda. And I kind of live by that here in the Eco Village in Tipperary. It is a long way to Tipperary, but I put up the link there to our story here, which is ongoing. But I won't take up your time. I appreciate that even a small number of people talking like this is beneficial. And it's encouraging to think that others will come maybe and dip in later. So thank you is my main message.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, it goes back a few years, right? I'd say at least 3 or 4 years.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I remember I really enjoyed your story and the Eco Village. We try to encourage people to think about, I don't tend to use the words solutions, which is a common way to talk about, what do we do now? Let's solve it. Climate change. I tend to use the term like positive, let's find a positive way forward. It gives us more opening to actually doing something that doesn't have to solve and be done with climate change. But I think that this, Eco Village or transition town community resilience approach is so essential, and that's built. It started in Europe. It started in the UK in the probably early 2000s. The transition town movement, and I think it's such a great model for connecting as a community and not living these kind of isolated lives where we're just trapped in our little consumer bubbles, but we're citizens. We're part of a community, and we're working together to find ways to make a better future. And I think it might seem like a small thing to have a climate resilient community, but that's really huge. Just taking that ownership of what do we want the future to look like, even just in our little town or our region. So what I got the sense from Paul is that that's what your focus is, and that's what your community is really taking on as a challenge. And so I definitely support that.
But it's worth mentioning that the founder of the Transition Town movement is just now involved in a sort of media project, Rob Hopkins. And he actually he and others, of course, started the Transition Towns movement in Ireland, in Kinsale, Ireland, and then moved to, as you rightly say, UK. There were some unhappy events with the Eco Village project that they had. and he left as a result of those unhappy episodes. But the hopeful point of what he's doing right now is voices from the future. He and others are involved in a media event just in these days, right now, in Totnes in Cornwall. And they are role-playing voices from the future where we have in fact broken through to regenerative flourishing, that we have in fact transcended the pathologies and have learned to enter into synergy with the earth and all our species and so on. And that's rather a fascinating thing to do. And I'm looking forward to the outputs from that. But yeah, a hopeful note.
Is that at Schumacher College? Is that where that's happening?
But he's based in Totnes in Cornwall. But
Totnes in Cornwall. Okay.
Yes, he's a very sought after speaker. And he's also taken to visual art, which I identify with because, the transcendental is available through all forms of art, so that we can actually transfigure our experiences through art. It's a way that the spirit speaks through us. And of course, there are many media. And what they're doing right now is using smart media to envisage futures, regenerative flourishing. Language becomes so tired that, threadbare words like sustainable lose their vivid colors, So language like regenerative flourishing, a word like degrowth is unappetizing to the contemporary kind of psyche. But if you talk about flourishing, and that less is more, and that fitness, eating less, is better for one. These concepts of fitness and flourishing are so important if we want to get a psychological breakthrough, a kind of critical mass breakthrough. But as you have already said many times, as our Prime Minister, Taoiseach, just sat down with a certain creature in the Oval Office, followed by Zelensky and so on, you really need all your courage and belief in humankind to get past these scenes that are playing out, not to mention the wars that are raging. It's appalling in human behavior. It's unconscionable what's happening. We have to live in hope. So I leave it there. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you for your input, Paul. Well, it is that time to begin to wrap up, and I'm wondering, Jason, if you have any final words or any kind of individual actions you want to propose to people to consider. And because for me, part of this is continuing the process in these series of just exposing people to begin to think and, this is an action, or that's an action, or this is something I can do, or something that begins the process of finding our own, I don't want to say solutions, but our own kind of way of swimming in all of this to the best of our ability.
Well, the Climate Stories Ambassadors initiative, which I mentioned before, I think is a great way to get started with climate storytelling. So just a reminder, starting on April 3rd. And if you want to check that out, just go to the Climate Stories Project website. There's a application, very simple application form there. If that's not something that you're feeling like you want to take on, just a very simple act of recording your climate story, or just having a conversation about climate change with someone maybe you wouldn't normally speak with about it. It could be a family member, friends, and we do have some resources on our website which you are kind of DIY information to help you have those conversations and tell your story. So there's lots of ways to get involved. Our hope is that climate storytelling is something that can really feels like a positive step in the right direction, even if it might seem small. It's a really powerful tool for engagement and for inspiring action and connecting with other people around this really difficult issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I just want to remind people who are actually here on the call that there's a lot of resources here in the chat, and that the way to save the chat is to go all the way to the top of the chat, and you'll see the 3 dots at the very top. And if you click there, you can save chat, and that'll save it on your computer. So I can see that, yes, I've heard a lot about Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson's book, and I'm very interested in it. So thank you for posting that. And I see Paul has his SoundCloud, his climate story. And so, yes, I want to thank Jason for showing up and joining us in the midst of the craziness of grading papers and everything that's required in his job right now. And also, of course, want to thank ISMETA for hosting this. And I hope those of you watching on YouTube will take advantage of the links that I post on YouTube, that you can join the conversation and get involved. So thank you, everybody, for coming and for heeding Rebecca Solnit's words, that the pain you feel is because you love and care so much. So remember to continue the process of caring and loving and finding that which lifts you up. So thank you all.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks to everyone who's here today. And yeah, hope to see you in some way, shape, or form going forward.
Yeah, beautiful. Bye-bye.